magnify.
The life support systems on the ship are failing, sir.
Hello. I've discovered quite a few very interesting facts about the Star Trek Next Generation Series 1 episode, Heart of Glory. In this episode, Worf must make a decision to decide to choose between his loyalty to Starfleet and to his Klingon heritage when two Klingon fugitives take over the Enterprise. On the bridge at the start of the episode, when Picard asks Geordi if they can use the visual acuity transmitter, Captain Picard puts his arm gently around Geordi's slender waist. This was to make Captain Picard seem like a warmer character and to seem closer to his shipmates, as feedback from earlier episodes indicated that the fans thought that Captain Picard was as cold as a pair of Tiberian bats, as well as the scene with Captain Picard putting his arm around Geordi like an old lover. He also gently takes Deanna Troy's hand later in the episode, but that's less interesting.
We have heard this ship can separate in time of battle. Yes.
Actor Rodnett Bleemer, who plays one of the Klingons in the episode, this isn't the only time he actually plays a Klingon, and it's also not the only thing that he plays. He also plays video games. In 1999, he would go on to get the world record for Crazy Taxi in the arcade, helpfully delivering hundreds of people to the destination to the thumping beats of Bad Religion's 10 in 2010. It's funny to think that when he was acting in Star Trek in 1988, that the only Crazy Taxi he would have had at the time is an ordinary taxi, maybe taking him to work, or perhaps taking him home from a disgraceful sex party. The actor, of course, would go on to play another Klingon role later in Star Trek. He would later play Alexander, the popular Klingon warrior seen in Star Trek Deep Space Nine in Series 6. In this first appearance of Klingons in Star Trek, the actors were instructed to act like damp devils. Not knowing what damp devils were, they made up their own bizarre mannerisms while trying to characterize damp devils to the best of their abilities. The way that these brave actors moved and talked would set as a template for all future Klingons in Star Trek, even those that were in rubbish Voyager episodes like Barge of the Dead. During the creation of the episode, Rick Berman determined 3 key characteristics that all Klingons should have about their person from this very moment. All Klingons must be bearded, showing that they are rough and tough. Secondly, they should have fairy nets hanging from their belts amongst their other terrifying weapons. And thirdly, all Klingons must have the most disgraceful looking teeth this side of Ferenginar. Rick Berman had to be shut down for his 4th and most unreasonable demand about Klingon characteristics. He wanted all Klingons to have a single beautiful horn coming out of their head, like a weird space-bearded alien unicorn man. Gene Roddenberry put his foot down, reminding Rick that the Klingons in Star Trek 3 didn't have this feature, threatening to sack Rick on the spot if he ever mentioned it ever again. This is how good Star Trek had become. Actor Michael Dorn had been sidelined for a while after smashing his mouth off on a fairground ride accident, but it had healed very well by this point, allowing him to finally eat and talk again. He really showed off his Klingon skills in this episode, garnering the nickname Klinger amongst his actor friends on the Star Trek show. Little is known about the accident that befell him at the fairground, except that he fell face first into 3 or 4 moving gears behind a fast-moving ride. Luckily, some of his teeth that were dislodged during the accident clogged up the gears and ground it to a halt before it could cause permanent damage to his sweet face. Truly a Klingon of all situations. You know the phrase about cherry custard being worth more than it's worth? That's because no matter how many cherries you use or how much custard you mix, you'll never have less than you started with. That saying never rang more true than as a metaphor for the Klingons' actions in this episode. It really is thought-provoking. That's how good Star Trek had become. Episode writer Maurice Hurley did virtually no homework on the rich history of Star Trek before putting pen to paper for this episode. He wouldn't know a Tholian from a Romulan or a Swaggler from a Klingon, which is apparent from the early draft of his episode, where he described Klingons as wide-faced kidney heads. Unsure as to exactly what he was describing, Paramount instructed more seasoned writers to help him with his bizarre characters and to bring them to life. Thanks to D.C. Fontana and Herbert Wright, the end product is an episode featuring Klingons, but I can't help but wonder what they'd have looked like as wide-faced kidney heads. Did you notice in this episode there's a couple of scenes that seemed a little empty? In a bid to stay ahead of their competitors, Paramount head Frank Mancuso Sr. passed a rule that each Paramount show must have a scene with nobody in it, at least once every half an hour. That's why in this episode it goes from a scene on the bridge with all of the senior staff to a few seconds of an empty ready room before reverting to a fun action-packed scene with Klingons. There were 2 or 3 empty room scenes in each episode for 5 or 6 episodes in a row until it was realised that it held no value at all except in saving having to pay for any actors. In fact, at one point it was suggested by Rick Berman himself to Frank Mancuso Sr. that maybe they should try an entire episode with no actors at all, just panning shots of empty rooms. This of course didn't happen, unless it happened in secret and there's an unaired episode out there especially made for weirdos. This is how good Star Trek had become. As the first episode to feature multiple Klingons, discussions were had in the production office on how to make the Next Generation Klingons stand out more from the original series Klingons and the movie Klingons. The movie Klingons added the famous forehead ridges, sharp teeth and sawdust, but the Next Generation Klingons were to bring something else to the table and make them stand out. Rick Berman and Denise Okuda decided that contemporary Klingons were to have no ears. The Ferengis were all about their large ears. The Romulans and Vulcans are immediately recognised for their ears, and so the Klingons should go in the other direction and have none at all. The stumbling block that they came across was 1. Even very thick makeup wouldn't conceal ears very well, and 2. Without ears, Klingons couldn't hear, and yet the script called for them to communicate, so they must be able to hear. Unfortunately, the plan to have modern Klingons designed with no ears was scrapped. But this is how good Star Trek had become. Thanks ever so much for listening to my very interesting facts about the episode Heart of Glory from Star Trek Next Generation Series 1. Please subscribe if you haven't, otherwise don't, that's all great. And please come back because I'll have some fantastic facts for the next episode, and wow, are there some good ones. Okay, thanks guys, bye bye.